Okay, so this is a brief audio review for Chapter 6, Diversity in Families, Class, Race, and Gender. Okay, so obviously we've been talking about class, race, and gender as macrostructural systems, meaning that they really affect the way that the family is understood, how people experience the family, right? But they are personal identities, but they're also structural factors, right? So some other conditions that also produce inequalities in the family are age, family characteristics, place of residence. But again, class, race, gender, they're very important, right, in the way that they shape kind of our opportunities in our lives. So they are forms of stratification, and they influence family life through the distribution of social resources and opportunities. So they're also relational systems of power and subordination, meaning each one is a cultural hierarchy that says that if you're at the top, you have more value, you have more say. So let's say within the family, if we have a patriarchal belief in the culture, right, that men should have power and dominance in a gender system, then that translates into patriarchal roles within the family to say that the man is the king of the castle, the head of the household, that a woman defers to her husband, things of this nature, right? And just even the normative or traditional gendered aspects of what a couple should be like, or, what children should act like depending on their gender, things like that. So obviously social class is a very obvious stratified system, as it literally tells you it's stratified, right? It's upper, middle, lower. So class also forms a lot of relational systems, it is a relational system of power and subordination as well, because the kind of opportunities you're going to have has a lot to do with your social class, as you're going to learn doing your group project, right? That social class influences the daily lives of individuals, but also a lot of their social value, right? We think that rich people are more worthy or valuable than poor people in the culture. So there's kind of that internal experience, right? The micro of experiencing social class, but then there's also the outside society value system, right? The macro, the structural inequality that says that rich people have more value than poor people, or that rich people's family structures are the ideal, right? Such as the stay-at-home mother, etc. And of course, race is intricately linked to class and gender in how it represents what families are idealized, what family roles should or should not be, and of course, trying to essentialize a white suprematic norm, right? To say that white families are the norm and anyone else is a deviation, or that white families should be the goal, right? So again, that's how their systems of power and subordination, because some people get status from them and other people lose status from them. And so they're all interconnected, right? They work together. And so that's why, this really affects how it puts people in different social locations, which of course produces those diverse family patterns that we actually experience. So they influence families, yet families can also be an important, system of agency or way to resist inequality as well. So it is interesting how families, they're much more dynamic than just being affected by outside structures. They also make choices in their daily lives, and the way that they live can actually be a counter to those stereotypes. Okay, so when you're talking about social stratification, it's important to just understand, the what it is, but also how it's related to the actual experiences and lives that families have. So social stratification is just structured inequality, meaning that our inequalities in society aren't caused by, quote unquote, nature, by biology, right? It's much more these cultural or lifestyle differences that we have that say that, certain groups should be privileged or preferenced. And so, of course, race, class, and gender have a lot to do with this, right? They structure those hierarchies, and they're kind of embedded in all of our other social institutions, right? So when you talk about understandings of gender, obviously in the context of the family, all of these things are important, but also think about other social institutions, right? When you think about the economy or education or, religion or any of these other things, they also structure expectations of social class, expectations of gender, things like this. So they're built into our institutions, right? And that's why people have such a hard time, especially with gender being a binary, they have such a hard time with it being non-binary, largely because then it's like a organizing principle that if you take it away, it just crumbles. People's understanding of the entire world crumbles because they don't have this, you're this or that to kind of stand upon, right? So, for example, a lot of different institutions intersect the family. So even the kind of social, somewhat state, somewhat religious institution of marriage overlaps, these kind of notions. So this idea that now that same-sex marriage is legal, there's still a lot of those misunderstandings that we've kind of discussed. How people will say, well, who wears the tux? Who wears the dress? When the idea that you would fit a same-sex marriage into a heteronormative frame is just ridiculous, right? It is different, but we still can only see the world through this duality of someone wears a tux, someone wears a dress, right? This kind of basic way that these things have become such strong organizing principles for us that we can't even understand or conceptualize the world outside of these false frames that we've created for ourselves, right? So basically, obviously this rests on group-based inequalities, right? So that's a big part of this, is that really trying to give some people power, differentiating other people as inferior, right? And so this is where the stratification comes from, to kind of privilege one group over the other. And when it comes to life chances, that just refers to the chances an individual has throughout his or her life cycle. And really, this is just, whether or not you get to experience those good things in life, right? Or if you're kind of toiling and barely surviving. So different social locations produce, different life chances. So social stratifications put people in these different social locations. So if you think about it from an intersectional perspective, each one of your categories of identity that you're in, that's kind of been defined by society, race, class, gender, sexuality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? They have certain power differentials in them. So if you can check the box of power in each one, like if you're like a cisgendered, white male who's religious, who et cetera, like you can check every box, who doesn't have a disability, who et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's still going to be some sort of ways in which you're placed in a hierarchy where you're not at the top, right? So there's this idea of the matrix of domination that, we are simultaneously privileged and oppressed. So our social location comes from those boxes we check. So if you're very rich, very privileged, have white privilege, have all of these privileges, then it just means you're going to experience the world differently, and you're going to have many more opportunities than somebody who is maybe, a person of color, also, disabled, queer, things of this nature that really cause social stigma in society and also cause a lot of kind of roadblocks to success and opportunity just because of the structure of opportunity, right? Obviously, being born wealthy is a help in a capitalistic society, right? So those social locations really produce different family dynamics. And obviously, the diverse family arrangements that we see are a reflection of the kind of ways that people try to cope with and struggle with and deal with the different locations that they experience. So class, race, and gender are structures of power as well as systems that distribute social resources. So they structure the ability of the affluent to dominate the poor, right? Of men to dominate women, and of whites to dominate people of color. So they kind of set up these opportunities, these structures that justify power relationships that are unequal, right? So these power relationships structure the experiences of all families in different ways. So different family forms in society are interdependent, right? So the existence of power relations between families that have different social locations means that, men and women from, different, let's say, racial groups experience things differently, from different class groups experience it, right? Just as different, all of these different kind of things interplay and affect and relate the way that we either benefit from the oppression of others or experience oppression and have less benefits, right? So all of this ties into that, again, the matrix of domination. The idea that individuals and families exist in this kind of sense where you're being privileged by some things and being, oppressed by others. So again, in my own, example of I'm able-bodied, so I'm privileged, right? I'm white, so I'm privileged. But at the same time, gender, being female, not privileged, right? And so that frames my experience maybe differently than somebody who might still have that same disadvantage of, in the social hierarchy of being female, but also is disabled or also is a person of color, and how those compounding, inequalities and the ways that people define and treat people are really connected in that sense affects what kind of opportunities you really have, right? So all of us experience these interconnections, and they have very important implications for our lives and what kind of opportunities we have and what kind of families we have, what kind of opportunities our children have, right? So people experience race, class, and gender differently depending on their location in those structures. So people of the same gender, again, are going to experience things differently based on their class, based on their race, based on their sexuality, right? In the same way that, people that are the same in the social class structure, to say like, oh, well, all poor people experience this. Well, that's not true, right? Because there's different elements depending on these other locations. In the same way, you can't say all men experience blank, because not all men experience the same thing, right? Their social class, their race, their sexuality, all of these other things, nationality, etc., age, there's just a million of these, disability or ability. Those things really frame and affect the kind of experiences you actually have, right? So our experiences are a matter of our various social locations. And the systems of inequality we have in our culture just kind of create an imbalance of power, right? Not just in the society, but also within our families, right? That some people in the family are privileged over others, and some people have more power and sway over others. So it affects the structure of the family, the way that people in the family identify themselves and their own worth, right? And so this does affect, kind of the structure and the understandings of the family. All right, so social class. That's just, an economic rank, right? People that have the same economic rank are basically a social class. And so it's interesting that when we look at social class, we don't just ask people, hey, what's your social class? Largely because research has shown that people just think they're middle class, largely because that's the narrative in the culture, is always talking about the middle class. But people that are making, under $20,000 a year and people are making over $500,000 a year are like, I'm middle class, and they're both not really right about that. But it is interesting that we often use, SES as a marker in social science, right? But also occupation, right? This is often used as an indicator of class. So we'll ask people, what do you do? Or even on surveys, you'll notice that they don't ask you, what's your social class? They'll ask you like how much you made per year or what your occupation is, to try and gauge what your relative economic rank or social class is. So again, when a number of people occupy the same relative economic rank in the stratification system, that's just considered your class. So it's difficult to say where one ends and another begins, right? It's kind of blurry on those lines, but these things are kind of in flux as the financial system itself in this country is in flux, right? Where we have a kind of a really unprecedented situation right now in the country. I mean, somewhat precedented, but at the point where the massive scale of which has never been seen in basically human history. The extreme amount of wealth being able to be compiled by just such a small few in our culture, while the bottom 50%, have less than 5 people in this country, right? So you have, millions of people versus a handful of people, and they have the same amount of money. So how did that happen? That has everything to do with the social stratification, the structure of society that values wealth and lets wealth have more power, right? So power, then again, not something we really get into in families class, but ability to game the system, to create laws and rules that benefit themselves so that they can then become wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. But the real consequence of social class, we're talking about it in the context of families, is what happens to the rest of those families? What happens to the shrinking middle class, where parents now have to work dual income and that's not even enough money anymore? So then they go into credit card debt, right? Something we'll talk about a little bit later in the class. So what happens, when those economic opportunities just stop being there because of globalization and the kind of service economy, right? What we call the dual labor market, where you have to have a certain level of education in order to get most job opportunities, right? But again, education, capitalism, you have to pay for education. So what parents can put their kids through school? Only the most affluent. So who does the capitalist system of paying for healthcare, paying for college, paying for all these things, who does it benefit? The rich, because they can pay for it, The rest of us can't, so we're behind. So even if our kid is smarter than that rich kid, they can't get into Yale because they're not going to have the same opportunities to pay for test prep, to pay for college, to kind of get through those barriers that are being placed there because of a capitalistic system that benefits the wealthy, right? So, or as we've seen recently, how some celebrities, even if their kids did have every opportunity, still were paying their kids' way to fraudulently get into a school by photoshopping them into photos. But anyway, so what's interesting about this is, what kind of opportunities your families have. And again, this is why this is part of your project for your group project, is to try to adapt your family to the kind of economic issues that families will face. And you'll see if you were lucky enough to roll a 6 or a 5 and have like a good standard of living, any of those things are easy to weather. But if you're making, if you're at the bottom of that rolling list, 1 or a 2, you're making under $30,000 a year, it's very difficult to just even pay the bills and just have the roof over a kid's head, let alone accommodate for things that happen, right? So that's kind of how it works in the micro sense of affecting the structures of our everyday life, right? Like that a lot of the things middle-class youth take for granted are just not available to poor youth, not because their parents don't care, even though that's mostly the meritocracy narrative we use, but largely because they can't afford it, right? Because they're just trying to scrape by. All right, so different theories on social class. The first is the cultural approach, which basically says that each class has its own culture, lifestyles, values, attitudes, and motives that are unique. So again, that kind of has to do with how you interact and how you understand the world. So basically they say that comparisons between classes turn out to be deficit accounts of lower status families, right? So the problem with the cultural approach is that it's kind of like what we, that this other approach that we used to call, it's escaping my brain right now. Just this kind of almost like blaming the poor, right? Or the issues of, cultural explanations often just say, well, if the poor are poor, it's because their parents are teaching them to be poor, which completely ignores the structural factors that actually makes sure that rich kids go to rich schools that have better resources, that poor kids go to poor schools with worse resources, things like that like cause structural disadvantages. So, often the cultural explanations are reflective of experience, meaning some research has shown that working class parents often teach their kids to defer to authority, meaning they assume their kids are never going to be managers or in charge, so that they have to just kind of listen to what the boss says and put their head down and work through it. Versus middle class youth are taught to have more of a sense of entitlement, to question, to kind of object to things. So they're the kind of person that's going to like question the professor on their grade or things like that, versus a working class student would never think to do that, largely because they're being socialized for a different outcome in life. So there is obviously some element of kind of symbolic interactionist effect of living in different worlds, which is really what social class does for us. It makes us live in different worlds. But at the same time, cultural explanations really obscure the social material realities of class, right? That there's this kind of culture of poverty argument, right? That says that the poor are just bad people, right? They're just lazy, they're moochers, and that's why they're poor, right? Instead of actually looking at how, there are a lot of inequalities that are kind of structuring or shaping their lives. So having, less opportunities for jobs that pay well, because one thing that people always talk about is having jobs, but what kind of jobs? Are they part-time jobs? Are they full-time jobs? Do they offer benefits? Do they pay a living wage, right? Those are the things that are often kind of obscured in that cultural approach. And the structural approach examines the ways in which social class shapes the networks of relationships between families, individuals, and institutions. So basically, like, for example, they look at occupations that people have and how that's a key part of the class structure. Because again, what kind of job you have is going to be linked to a certain level of income, which is obviously going to give families different resources and opportunities. Also, not only with money, but those jobs that have a high status are more valued in the culture. And so that gives different kind of status and value to the people working in those industries as well. So social classes are power relationships, right? They involve domination and subordination. So this means that some have privilege and are more highly valued, right? And so it's not just a matter of not working hard enough, it's a matter of, kind of already having a leg up from birth. All right, so families in today's continuum. So, with the high rate of unemployment and limited social opportunities, there's a lot of poor families that have to kind of try to figure out or use their agency to try and adapt to do whatever they can to survive. So this is a complicated situation when people get involved in like the underground economy. So they start selling drugs or things like that, because it's considered an immoral thing. But oftentimes when you really examine this and you see why are people doing it, a lot of them are saying to support their families. And they're living in areas where they just don't have access to actual decent paying jobs. Largely, again, deindustrialization, globalization, things like that have really changed our economy in dramatic ways. And as a result, there's a lot of people that were just kind of left out. And so they have to really struggle to get by. Blue-collar families are the largest single group of working families in the U.S. When it comes to middle-class families, they are pretty much sustained by the economic contributions of like a dual income house, right? So meaning if it's a heterosexual couple, like, man and wife working, and really not working in a just kind of minor part-time position, but often both full-time job earners, largely because the middle-class lifestyle that was available to generations past came as a result of union wage jobs, which we don't have anymore. We have the lowest union membership that we've ever had right now in this country. At the same time period, we have the biggest deficit in wages between the top earners and the lowest earners. So in middle-class families, in order to still have that house, that nice car, those things like that, they can't do it just by making money by one income. So then they have a second income. And even that doesn't really support them. They often have to go into debt, take out second mortgages, credit cards, things like that, just to be able to have that standard of living. So families of professionals, they work a lot of hours, they get paid well, and they often have more status because of the jobs that they do. But it's difficult for them to merge the spheres of work and family, meaning that, if you have to work a 60-hour week or just have a job that requires a lot of your time and attention towards maybe research or development, or, you're an architect or something where you're spending a lot of time kind of working in the craft of your job. Obviously, even though that pays a better standard of living than those blue-collar people that are working a lot of hours, it does pull you away from family expectations, yet a lot of those career paths also offer, vacations and, retirements and benefits and things like that that do support families. And when it comes to wealthy families, their network of influence in the global economy and their ability to generate additional resources is what distinguishes them from the rest of society. Right? So they actually do well when we don't do well. Like Donald Trump famously said that, the recession was good for him because he was able to buy a bunch more properties and things like that cheap. But when you're really looking at what was the recession for most people, there was a lot of suffering, right? A lot of people became homeless. A lot of people lost their retirement that they worked their whole lives into because some greedy billionaires wanted to manipulate interest rates and destroyed the entire world's economy as a result, though none of them went to jail at all. There was no prosecution at all for any of that. Yet, the consequence was millions of people lost their homes, lost their retirements, and ended up either on the street or in bad circumstances, right? So wealthy families, they're able to really not just, ride the tide of bad economic times, but to capitalize on it. It actually benefits them, right? And also, they're able to craft policy and, change things that structure the world as the best for them, right? So again, do you care about paid maternity leave when you have $1 billion? No, right? Because why does that doesn't matter to you. You can take as much time off as you want, right? So it's things like that. When you think about it, it kind of makes sense, especially the fact that the majority of all people in the Senate are millionaires. You start to think, oh, right, so the people making our laws don't actually live our lifestyles, therefore are often crafting legislation that favors the people who are lining their pockets, right? Corporate interests and other elites that want to kind of have the system work the best for them. Okay, so when it comes to race, obviously racial stratification has a lot of structural foundations. The US itself is moving from being predominantly white to being a more global society of diverse racial and ethnic people. So historically in the US, We've always looked at race as a very black and white dichotomy because, again, we love dichotomies. And those meanings are really constructed in the time. So, as the change in society changes, also the way that we understand race and ethnicity has to change, because it's always kind of been constructed as an us-them or as a tribalistic kind of understanding and a very dualistic understanding when it's always been much more complicated and nuanced than that. So Omi Monod talk about their racial formation theory that argues that society is always creating and transforming racial categories because they're not real, right? Scientifically, race doesn't exist. It's a social reality, not a biological reality. So when you think of race in the social context, it exists as a category that serves as a basis for differentiation, right? We look at people differently, we treat them with different status, value, etc. But this also has to do with a differential distribution of power, right? Of privilege, of prestige. So racial stratification produces different opportunities that shape families in a variety of ways, right? So obviously racism is a huge impact that it affects families, not just from like a structural impact, but also from the micro impact of having to deal with it every day. Like it's very difficult to kind of leave that at the door and just, smile and go home to your family. So also it results in, racism results in very, limited resources, whether it's economic resources to support your family. Oftentimes historically and today, we still see when it comes to the kind of confluence of race and class, we see that a lot of poor people, especially, racial minorities, live in inferior living conditions that have, we have this situation that we call, environmental racism, right? Where people of color are concentrated in areas with the most pollution, right? Live next to the dump sites, the plastic refineries, all of those kind of things that cause the most pollutants and cancers and things and toxins to the local environment. I mean, the Newark, New Jersey thing right now, Flint, Michigan, things like that, where, the water itself has poisoned many, many children. Especially with Flint, Michigan, you can really see how that was an outrage for like 5 minutes for America, and then everyone moved on, but it's still happening. They still don't have clean water. Like, it's insane that we live in a country where that is still happening. You have all of these kids who had long-term brain damage as a result of drinking water with lead in it, right? Because lead is a contaminant that just builds up in your body over time. So these kids unknowingly, even just, they can't, like, think about that. The logistics of that. It's not just drinking the water. You can't wash your hands. You can't brush your teeth. You can't take a shower. You can't do any of those things. It's insane. So at the same time, because these are poor communities, if that's something that happened in Malibu, guess what? It would be solved like immediately. But it's the fact that it's often poor communities that face these things the most. And when it comes to the health and the life outcomes of those children, right? Parents that have such low status are not able to really kind of have the voice in the culture that we care enough about, right? We care more about when, some little white girl goes missing than an entire town full of people that are suffering as a result of, an unelected city manager deciding to save a couple pennies by rerouting a toxic river into the water system, which leached out the lead from the pipes and caused all of these horrific problems. So, I don't know, that's just one example, right, of how living conditions are right now we have this issue with detention camps on the border and all of these things that you have a lot of communities that are immigrant communities, and even if people are documented, it causes a lot of fear and resentment when there's these, immigration raids and sweeps that go through these areas. Like, I don't know if you guys heard about that one where recently happened where there were kids that went to school, and then when they came home, their parents just were gone in an immigration raid, and you have all these little kids at an elementary school because their parents are gone and they have nowhere to go, which is like horrific, right? But again, it's the politics of it that if someone is a racial minority or an ethnic minority, it's because we live in a white supremacy culture, right, that values white supremacy in a racist culture, then we don't value the lives of, migrant children the same way that we do white children, right? So again, these things matter. Like the social context of these things is that, you're going to have different lifestyles, you're going to have different opportunities, you're going to have different struggles than the kind of way that we portray the dominant family system in America. All right, so understanding some of these theories as well. Cultural approach, again, to race has really been idealized model of family life, kind of put as this white, rich norm. But again, that misrepresents ethnic families as it casts them as different, as if it's not, all families are pretty unique in a lot of ways. So with the cultural approach, again, it really focuses on specifically minority families and says, well, if they're struggling, it's because their culture is wrong, right? So the shortcomings of that approach, obviously, it reduces family lives to group culture, right? When obviously, yes, your culture matters, but that's one aspect that matters, and that's not somehow all reflective of exactly your life chances. Also, it views the family as the bedrock of society rather than being shaped by social forces, meaning that if you are poor or if you're living in an area with gangs, it's because your parents were like, gangs are good, right? Which is not, obviously not always the case. That really oversimplifies and doesn't understand the kind of more complicated context that people are living in, right? So it ignores the way that, life is shaped by social forces, how racism affects who gets a job, where people get to live, right? Things like that. It also blames victims and ignores the impacts of not just the racism, but the economic structure of family formation, meaning that it wasn't really that long ago that there was legal discrimination in housing, in education, right? Meaning we always talk about the Brown v. Board and things like that, but there were separate schools set up for all racial ethnic minorities, right? So in Southern California, there were schools that were like, Latinx only schools, right? Or, just specifically for Asian immigrants, right? So it's even more nuanced than that. It's actually interesting. There was a case in Westminster that was actually one of the precedent cases for Brown versus Board. But anyway, basically, really looking at how when you set up these separate systems, when you allow for that inequality to flourish and be distinguished into law, even when those things are structurally changed in the law, it still has like a ripple effect that takes a lot of generations to actually change. And we haven't done the de facto work of making our communities less segregated, right? They still are very racially and ethnically segregated. So that means that, your experience of family life is obviously going to be affected by where you live. And a lot of people believe in racist tropes and stereotypes because they just don't interact with people that are different than them. So it's pretty easy to believe like, oh, this entire group does this or this entire group acts like this because that's all they see on TV or that's all they read in maybe their conservative news or whatever it might be. But the reality is when you actually come in contact with people and you see their way of life, it often can break those stereotypical understandings, right? So the cultural approach is all about the stereotypes. It often treats African American families and especially, African American Latinx families as monolithic, meaning there's like the African American family, right? Like that all of those families look exactly like this. And that's just not real, right? It doesn't acknowledge the wide range of family forms that have always existed for people of color, right? And the ways that people are actually trying to overcome those structural problems in order to have a decent family life for their kids, despite all of the inequality, right? So then there's the structural inequalities in racial ethnic families, meaning the structural approach or understanding. So obviously social conditions associated with racial inequalities produce aggregate differences between minority and white families. So a lot of this just has to do with if you're not given opportunities, you have to adapt, right? And as minority families adapt to the structural inequalities, they develop new forms of family organization and support, right? So we still see that a lot of these inequalities are still very present today. It's not just an issue of the past, right? There are huge disparities in the income levels of white families versus Black or Latinx families. So you have, African American and specifically African American families are 3 times more likely to be poor than white families. Same things with Latinx families, same problem. And so a lot of this has to do with not just the structural problems of the past, but also the current inequalities that still preference white people for jobs, for education, and really just in the social understandings, right? There's this video I show in another class that talks about, job discrimination and how it still is a problem in our culture. And it's basically this guy, one of the examples is this guy who just changes one letter in his name, and he goes from not getting any job applications back to getting a bunch of job applications, like to getting calls for those jobs. And all he did was drop the S from his name. So he went from Jose to Joe, and he got a bunch of responses. So again, it's not that people see the Jose resume and they just like throw it away, but it's the way that often the unconscious bias that really trickles into everyone, regardless of their color, that comes from the kind of structure of society, the way we see people treated, affects the way that we then value each other and, who you think is more suited for a job, Joe or Jose, right? When literally every characteristic is exactly the same. So these things are still problems that continue to today, but we're a little bit more in the dark in the kind of facing them as a reality. Okay, so looking at different racial groups and how they deal with some of these problems. So African American families in the 21st century, right, they basically are, because of structural disadvantages, history of oppression, current racism, and inequality, they're more likely than white families to reside in extended family households, meaning obviously you need more social support because you're not getting it from society. So maybe having more people contribute towards that particular rent is more helpful. So there are some social, demographic, and economic factors that affect how there's higher divorce rates in Black families. There's also lower marriage rates. And again, especially the economic factor. I mean, we'll talk about this later, but just the extreme costs of marriage, right, in our culture and the way we've really made it this weird capitalistic enterprise obviously affects that. So also African Americans tend to marry later and have higher rates of marital disruption than whites. And so research points to demographic and economic factors to explain this movement away from marriage. So based on economic conditions, social scientists have proposed that for many families, it makes sense that, if the economic concern is there and you're just trying to financially provide, then the marriage becomes less important than the kinship ties of exchange and co-parenting, right? Also, this idea of social support networks kind of comes from, again, explanations trying to understand. Social scientists were basically trying to find ways to understand the structural rather than the cultural explanations of kinship patterns among racial and ethnic groups. So for groups that are economically marginalized, there's a need for help, right? And as the social structure erodes, the need for family becomes, they become the help that is provided, right? But family's not enough. So in ethnographic research from your book, they talk about how Black families would pool their resources in larger kin groups that, were able to help people survive. Because again, you have to create those alliances and adapt in order to get by. So, this makes sense, especially when you're looking at, time periods where people were legally restricted from using banks or things like that, or redlining, which was, still an ongoing issue. But it's interesting that, there was research that there's this woman I heard her presenting at a conference talking about how these kinship networks happen within undocumented communities within Los Angeles, like street vendors. And she talked about this interesting exchange where basically, like, let's say there's X amount of street vendors that are all pooled together in this one group, that because they can't use banks because they're undocumented, like you need to show your social security card to use the bank, they would basically kind of become their own bank in a way. So the way it would work was every month, let's say every person puts in $100, right? And each month you just kind of turn a dial. And each month, okay, so now person 1 gets the whole pile of money. Then next month, person 2. Then next month, person 3. And it goes around in that cycle, right? So everyone puts in their $100, and maybe if there's 12 of them, once a year, they get $1,200, if that makes sense. So the idea is you can't put money into savings in the same kind of way because you don't have the banking structure. But being able to turn your 100 a month into 1,200 eventually means that you're able to maybe buy that other food cart you're looking for, or fix your car, or pay your rent, or whatever it might be. That money becomes kind of a windfall. And it was interesting when she talked about how they kept each other accountable, because it makes sense if you got your chunk of money, you could just kind of bail at that point. But what kept people accountable was the kinship, extended kinship networks within Mexico and Central America, meaning I know your mom, so you're not going to renege on the money to me because I will call up your mom, right? Things like that. So it's interesting how people use agency to develop social support networks that can actually, help them adapt to the problems their family is facing. Also, when it comes to inner city families and underclass debate, so there's two ways the underclass is explained. Again, one's cultural, one's structural, but both really focus on issues of family structure and poverty. And so nowadays we're trying to revisit this understanding of the culture without blaming the victim. So again, saying how obviously in a social interactionist frame, how you grow up, the experiences you have, the kind of neighborhood or environment that you're in is going to affect the kind of values you have, the structure of, how you see the world. But at the same time, it's not enough to just say like, well, you learned the wrong thing from mom and dad, therefore that's why X, Y, or Z. It's much more complicated than that. But it can be interesting just to see how different culture develops or how different values develop based on lived experience, right? So trying to kind of revisit those debates instead of looking at it in a victim blaming way is a good way to kind of, the social scientists are trying to revisit these things. When looking at Latinx families in the 21st century, poverty rates have risen alarmingly, right, for families, especially for Hispanic families, specifically Chicano families, right? So there's kind of this underclass that develops, right, where some people gain employment, and that kind of does distinguish them from the traditional Black underclass, but the jobs that are found are low wage. They don't bring families out of poverty, and so people just have to keep getting more and more and more and more of those jobs. So one of your readings that I had assigned previously talked about, familism, that kind of obligation orientation towards your family. And in the reading, they talked about the different elements of it, right? Feeling that you need to put your family before yourself, right? Sacrificing for your family, those kind of values, right? And really that people felt that if their family members needed help, they needed to help them, right? And so this is kind of just an example of how people of color have to acclimate to difficult circumstances and adapt their household structures to kind of, fix those gaps. Also, when looking at other ethnic diversity in families, Asian Americans are really often seen as the model minority, meaning they're well-educated, upwardly mobile, but that really ignores the history of discrimination against Asian Americans. Also the fact that when you look at the kind of pan-ethnic category of Asian, you're squishing a lot of different cultures into that one banner. And while there are some immigrant groups that are more successful, there are still many Asian immigrant groups that are very, that aren't thriving, that aren't kind of fitting into that mold of what's considered the model minority. And they do struggle to adapt and to kind of get those same opportunities. Also, Native Americans have diverse family arrangements, right? Obviously, when you're talking about like kind of colonial times, you had hundreds of different groups that had their own tribal, value systems, family systems, their own languages, things like that. And so there are still a lot of, people that kind of exist either in the nations or otherwise that, produce those kind of family systems for their own families, right? The kind of diverse family forms. And so, again, languages, cultural, understandings, things like that. So there's going to be a lot of variability in history and practice when you're talking about hundreds of different groups. Also, Middle Eastern families are very, it's interesting because there's a lot of stigma and stereotypes since the kind of post 9/11 time period. But there is a lot of ethnic and religious diversity when it comes to Middle Eastern families, which makes it very difficult to generalize about their family arrangements, right? So sometimes it's kind of the same way that when we look at Latinx families, it depends on where you live in the U.S. You say like, if you live in California, everyone's Mexican. If you live in New York, then, everyone's Puerto Rican, right? Those kind of over-assumptions that people make. And so the same kind of thing happens often for Middle Easterners, right? Where people kind of grapple with one group or understanding, but don't really understand the real context or diversity of groups, right? Like for myself personally, I used to live near what's called Little Arabia in West Anaheim. And what's interesting is just even within an enclave, you have a diversity of language and expression, right? So it's not just Arabic, there's Farsi, right? And there's kind of just depends on the specific regional differences between groups and the specific countries and their complex histories and cultures and developments that affect the kind of language and preferences and all of those things. So again, we just love to slap everyone into one bubble and kind of put them all together so that we can stereotype and categorize. But really, you know, groups are much more complex than the pan-ethnic categories we put on them. So again, human agency, family formation, that's really what you got to take away from it, is that, you know, people of color are using their families to help them adapt to different circumstances. So family strategies is just a concept that helps us think of some of the ways that people use their families to cope with problems in their lives. So without family adaptation, the inequalities we see that are still going on in our society would be even more pronounced. All right, when it comes to gender, this is the patterning of difference and domination through socially constructed distinctions between women and men. So again, all of them organizing principles, right? Gender, race, class, all of that fun stuff. So the traditional gender role approach is that, you know, men should be breadwinners, women should be domestic roles in the family, you know, the stay-at-home mom. And the perspective ignores what is most important about the roles. They're unequal. They have unequal power. They have unequal resources, unequal prestige. So the family itself is a gendered institution, right? It holds a lot of kind of gendered assumptions, a lot of gendered practices, like what, it's really interesting, like to father versus to mother. If you say, oh, that person's so, you know, mothering. Oh, yeah, she likes to mother me. That doesn't necessarily mean she's your biological mother, she gave birth to you, right? Like the verb mother, in that way of like, oh, she's mothering that person. That's much more like you're taking care of, you're nurturing someone, right? Versus to father someone is much more biological, right? It's like to have a kid. So it's interesting how that kind of, even just in the language, reflects our expectations that while men might have children, they're not supposed to take care of them in a social context, right? Versus, obviously these dynamics are changing, which is good. We're becoming more egalitarian in society, slowly but surely. But it does show how we do have differing expectations within the institution of family. Different power dynamics. Who should be in charge? Who should make the decisions? Things like that. And all of this really comes down to patriarchy, right? A social organization where men dominate women. So patriarchy is interpersonal, but it's also structural, right? Meaning it comes through in our private lives, in between our interactions with people, but it also comes through those public lives and our public institutions and values. So private patriarchy is male domination over women in interpersonal relationships, right? The mansplaining, the cutting someone off, all that kind of stuff would be private patriarchy. Public patriarchy refers to men's domination over women in larger institutions in society, right? The fact that women make up about 20% of, you know, elected office in Congress is upsetting, right? And that it will take, at that rate, hundreds of years for women to kind of finally gain equality within elected leadership. That's not great. So it does show how, you know, an example that could be the media, right? There's a lot of ways in which, you know, not only because of corporate domination of the media, there's about like 9 companies that own everything, about 90% of the media. Sorry, 6 companies that own 90% of the media. Sorry about that. And as a result, a lot of the people that are in power, that are on those boards, that are making the executive decisions for what we see, what we read, what we hear, are coming from a privileged position. So that patriarchal value system that they might have works its way into the media system itself. So there's an interesting kind of time period right now. We have this Me Too time period, this Time's Up in Hollywood time period. So I'm really interested to see where that ends up going. But largely, all it's trying to say is that we should actually like listen to women when they say that they've been raped or sexually assaulted. That we should give them, you know, some sort of just kind of basis of maybe even try to validate what they're saying is correct instead of just dismissing them as they're emotional, they don't know what they're talking about, they're too sensitive, they can't, you know, what, men can't do anything anymore, right? All of that kind of weird rhetoric we have in the culture. And the Time's Up thing was really not just about the sexual assault and, you know, kind of rape aspect of it, but also the fact that women are not paid the same in Hollywood, right? They don't have the same screen time. They don't have the same kind of opportunities for roles where they're able to be like the protagonist of a film. They're just kind of the sidekick or the, sexy body prop, but not really a person. And so it's interesting, like, that we still use the Bechdel test, right? This woman who highly recommend, Alison Bechdel, is a comic book artist who, again, highly recommend her stuff. That she came up with this thing, like, I don't even know, decades ago, called the Bechdel test, which is basically a standard, just a really baseline standard for, is there a female being represented in a film? Doesn't mean a film is feminist, doesn't mean a film is even good on women's issues. It just means, is there a woman in it? And it's actually, when you look at most films, they don't pass the Bechdel test. And it's such a simple test. It's, are there two or more women who are named, right? And did they talk to each other about something other than a man? And it's fascinating to see that even the majority of that kind of subgenre of female movies that we call chick flicks are actually do not pass the Bechdel test. Because so much of the focus of the woman, even though it's supposed to be the woman is the protagonist, the focus is only on her getting married, her having a kid, her winning the heart of so-and-so, or whatever it might be. Or in the case where she's in a position of power, is knocking her down a peg so she will accept marriage or kids or whatever because she's somehow cold-hearted without it. So, a lot of our understandings about gender come from the media and are reinforced through the media in some of the most horrific ways. Like, if I had time, I'd throw a bunch of videos in here, but you'll have to take my gender class instead, that kind of talk about just even kids' commercials. The way we gender that stuff is horrific. I mean, it's just as bad now as it was when I was a kid. And that's saying a lot, right? And so it's kind of interesting, like, they'll use the same Power Wheels car as, like, this is the thing they're selling. But then for guys, it's like, for men, it's tough, and it has, like, missiles and things like that. It's camo print. And then for girls, it's pink, and Barbie talks to you, and you look so pretty driving around town. And it just really shows how we construct these very different worlds for men and women. And a lot of different value structure, right? That women are supposed to only be valued for how they look, for being sex objects, and that men are supposed to only see that value in women. So in the same way we gender what kind of ways you're supposed to have roles within the family. So when a father stays at home to take care of his kids, we don't understand it, right? Because in our culture, we're taught that women are natural caregivers and men just don't know how to do it. Like, there's so many movies where men are like, help, I don't know how to take care of my kids. And it's literally a genre of film. So it just shows how the media often reinforces these inequalities within us. And so when it comes to agency within constraint, women may be subordinate in many ways, but they're not passive victims of patriarchy. Though, again, a lot of women do internalize patriarchy and do believe that they have less value or should have less value. That's why you see a lot of, like, anti-feminist women, which is such a weird thing. You're like, why wouldn't you advocate against your own interests? But at the same time, it makes sense because we're all drinking the Kool-Aid of society, especially with the media. We're all consuming all that crap. And it starts to affect the way that you then internalize the value systems that come through that media consumption, right? So women's resistance can take many forms, and even within media, it can be transformative, right? If you have a story coming from the perspective of someone who's marginal, it can often be transformative in the way that people understand things, right? But obviously, women's resistance within families, within, kind of the structure of, maybe you're treated differently because you're the daughter instead of a son, right? You have different restrictions on curfew or things like that, or different role expectations being a husband or a wife or being a mother or a father. And so women can resist these things in either active ways or more, somewhat subtle ways that kind of change the way that people understand things. Like, for example, for within my family, I didn't understand that my parents had things that were more egalitarian. To me, it was just normal until I had kids come over and spend the night for like a sleepover, and my dad made pancakes the next morning, and a bunch of my friends were like, wow, your dad can make pancakes? And I'm like, yeah, he can mix a batter with some water and an egg. Like, it's not super complicated. Not to, like, throw my dad down. I mean, he's great. He's really great. He can make things other than pancakes, but they were just like blown away by the fact that he could like turn on a pan and put stuff in it and like cook things. And it wasn't until that happened when I was a kid that I really realized that like that was the case for a lot of my friends, where they never saw their father cook anything. They only saw their mother play that role. And so for me, having parents, both parents working and my parents kind of sharing those duties, that just was what became normal for me. So oftentimes the family form you produce becomes the normal for your children that affects their standards and their expectations of their maybe future spouses. So for example, if you kind of are raised in a situation with a stay-at-home parent that dotes upon you and takes care of you and does a lot of those things, that might affect your mate selection later on, where you might look for someone that kind of follows that same role because that's what you expect, right? So again, a lot of these things women can push back, and men can as well. Men can embrace being a father. They can embrace being a stay-at-home dad or these kind of roles. And it does often change the way we understand those things in a larger societal context.